this, because now we have a situation where human beings aren't simply. It isn't simply a matter of human beings going from from immaturity to maturity, but human beings doing this under conditions where they make and seem constitutionally disposed to make all kinds of horrible choices that are damaging to others. And so what sin does is complexify this, because my vocation is something that now, I'm much more worried that my perceptions of my vocation may be tainted by all kinds of, issues of bad self-interest, or jealousy of others, or fear of others, and so on and so forth. So what sin does is make the discerning of vocation much more difficult. Right? Which is why, getting back to where I started, I don't want to make my theology of marriage based on my own sense of what's going to make me feel good. And as though that were it. This is what I feel is going to make me feel like a full person. Well, my senses of that may be very, very damaged. Okay? So I can't simply default to that. I could perhaps do that if there had been no sin, because then I would like to think that the desires God's implants in me apart from the effects of sin to carry me in the right direction. But I don't believe that I'm not infected by sin. So all of a sudden now, discerning my vocation becomes much more complicated. So what sin does is sin now raises the question of, okay, we really have vocation. We agree that this points to a notion that we have to have a open-ended sense of what humanity and human calling looks like, but we also have to realize that people are going to, in fact, work that out in ways that are sometimes not in accord with what God would want for them as individuals or for the people more broadly. So that's where sin comes in. So then one has to think more carefully about, okay, here's a particular claim for an appropriate vocation. How does one evaluate it? Right? Now, it's important to recognize in this context, particularly given the contemporary American sense of how this works, that for early Christians, it was precisely marriage that was the most problematic kind of vocation you could have, as far as we can tell, at least for Paul. And certainly people coming to Jesus doesn't seem to have actually been that. He was mostly where you didn't get divorced. That was pretty much it. But for Paul, marriage is clearly a worry. And it seems to have been a worry for a lot of early Christian writers. Now, that doesn't mean most Christians weren't in fact probably getting married, because they probably were, because that was the way things happened. But why were Christians suspicious of marriage? Well, I think you can't underestimate sort of the general bleeding in of Greco-Roman worries about, particularly more sophisticated ones, about the body and materiality and all that. But I think there's also a more important socioeconomic recognition that marriage served a very particular function in the ancient world. It was about securing power and influence. It was about trying to control the future. Okay, you arrange marriages. I mean, among those for whom marriage was, the wealthier classes, where it wasn't simply the most official and the most legislated under people like Augustus. Marriage was about getting, arranging things so that families consolidated property, and that it was able to be kept within certain confines ad infinitum, into the indefinite future. So marriage was fundamentally an economic arrangement. That was the context within which Christians were operating. It was very much focused on power and control in this world. And that looked to a lot of Christians like being like a misapprehension of where Christians' attentions should be. And that's the way Paul treats it in 1 Corinthians 7, for example. Right? It's distraction. Okay? It actually took Christians an enormously long time. Again, Christians were marrying throughout. But in terms of developing a theology of marriage, it took Christians much, much longer to develop a theology of marriage than a theology of singleness. I mean, Paul has a theology of singleness already. Right? And we see other dimensions of it. The order of, the fact that widows were a separate category, consecrated virgins, so on and so forth. So all kinds of ways in which Christians could theologize singleness as a matter of particular forms of vocation that had to do with the individual's discipleship to Christ. Marriage seemed to be problematic to the extent that it looked like what it was doing was actually creating a gap between the individual and Christ. At least that's the kind of issue that surfaces in 1 Corinthians 7. And so it takes a long time for Christians to think about what marriage was for. And you get the classic sort of Augustinian model is that it's for, it has three purposes for Augustine. It is for making progeny, keeps the world going, so a very practical notion. It is for mutual fidelity and trust. And the third one he calls, it's a mystery. It's a sacrament. I mean, the Latin words here are so this has to do with its public prolasis progeny. Okay, so this has to do with its sort of public function. It keeps society running. Fides has to do with its kind of, if you will, its interpersonal dimension. You develop a covenant with somebody else. And sacramentum has to do with its significance for the church. And here, a crucial passage, and I think one that ties back into some of the stuff I've already said, is Ephesians 5. Now, Ephesians 5 is a passage that's very fraught, as you all know. But one thing that's crucial right at the end is the interpretation of marriage that's given. And in fact, in the Latin translation, it's the word sacramentum is there. This is a great mystery, sacrament, namely Adam and Eve, the man leaving his father and going to cleave to his wife. And I refer it to Christ and the church, says Paul. Now, what does that suggest? Well, it suggests that one way of understanding what marriage is about, and in fact, there's kind of a scent, needless to say, I'm going to put the arrow down, for Augustine here in terms of what matters about all this. Okay? One way to understand marriage is, and this becomes very fruitful for later theologies of marriage, particularly in the West, is that marriage is a means of giving temporal shape, a temporal analogy to the life of glory. That's what marriage is about. And this is really its highest point. Now, of course, what that means is a further thing about that, which ties back into the eschatology dimension, is notice how Paul particularly phrases this. If you want to know what marriage is about, you don't look at Adam and Eve. Or if you do look at Adam and Eve, Paul says, what Adam and Eve is in fact referring you to is Christ and the church. So the measure of marriage isn't what Adam and Eve did. Adam and Eve are a sign for something else. And so what is normative about marriage is not what was the case in the garden, but what the case in the garden was, in fact, we now realize for Paul, that this was about pointing to the life of glory. And this becomes, then, a major consideration to think about in terms of how marriage is to be theologized. One of the aspects of early Christian theology, you get this example in John of Chrysostom, is precisely, of course, the fact that human vocation was no longer bound to the economic, political, and social concerns that grounded ancient marriage. Because Chrysostom says, because we believe in resurrection, we no longer have a stake, necessarily, in producing children. Our future destiny doesn't depend on the continuation of a biological line. Now, producing children is still well and good, but what does it become? It becomes a vocation, not a theologically grounded obligation. And of course, what one has is, with the development of Christianity, a huge development in the practice of adoption. The ancient Roman practice is if you had kids you didn't like, you exposed them and they died. Okay? With Justin, we have stories of, well, Christians, don't do that, and Christians bring in children, and this becomes part of, indeed, later on, it's not always done in the most, there are other factors going on here, but it is interesting that one of the major functions of monasteries, particularly in the medieval West, was to take in kids and raise them and make them part of the community. Now, again, it wasn't always anything but always hunky-dory and wonderful, Walton's kind of situation. But nevertheless, that's a theologically significant notion. That all of a sudden now, the ways in which one thinks of family are expanding.